The 007 video game franchise first started in 1983, with the game simply titled James Bond 007, and if you look most everywhere else on the internet, you'll find the same information. And it's wrong. Yes, I was wrong too. The series actually dates back a year earlier to 1982 with a game exclusively for the ZX Spectrum. You won't be able to find any footage of this game online, and only a couple of screenshots exist. So let me be the first to introduce you to the original James Bond video game, Shaken but Not Stirred. The game was developed and published by Richard Shepard Software, and it's a text-based adventure, having its own original storyline, making it the first Bond game to do so, not James Bond 007 The Duel. The plot involves a villain by the name of Dr. Death getting his hands on a nuclear warhead and threatening to blow up London if his ransom isn't received. Bond is briefed by M on the situation, then given 3 weapons by Q to help him defend himself on his mission to stop Dr. Death. The game is set up in 3 stages, the first of which has Bond travelling across the world collecting clues in the form of anagrams. Deciphering them will lead you to Dr. Death's island base. The second stage has Bond traversing those interconnected islands, searching for the evil Doctor's underwater lair. And then the third stage has 007 infiltrating the underwater lair, attempting to locate the control room so he can disarm the nuclear weapon. Now the combat is pretty simple. When you get into a skirmish with an enemy, you just type in what weapon you want to attack with. Enemies range from muggers and priests to scorpions and sharks. Some foes are riffs on actual Bond villains, so instead of Jaws, you'll fight Paws, and instead of Knick-Knack, you'll fight Tic-Tac. In that sense, the game seems to be pretty self-aware, and I would even go as far as calling it comedic at times. MI6's secretary is also called Miss Cashcoin, which begs the question, did Richard Shepard even have the rights to James Bond? There's so little information on this title that it's hard to tell if they made it without permission or they were just trying to be funny. I'm only able to show you the first stage of the game because for the most part it's not very self-explanatory and there are no guides for it online. Even with the sarcastic and difficult nature of the game, it seems the few people who reviewed it were actually quite impressed. Someone even went as far as to say it had the authentic feel of a Bond novel, so for the time, it was held in fairly high regard for a licensed game. Although Shaken but Not Stirred may be the true first 007 game, if you really want to get technical and count pinball, there is a 1976 pinball cabinet based off Casino Royale, and a 1980s one more specifically based on James Bond. They aren't technically video games, but just to cover my ass, I do think they're worth mentioning. Now that we've got that little housekeeping out of the way, I think it's time we discuss some cancelled 007 games, because there's actually quite a few. In 1983, James Bond 007 was released, but that wasn't the game initially planned. Parker Brothers originally announced a tie-in game with the 1983 Bond film Octopussy. There exists advertisements and screenshots of a game titled James Bond 007 as seen in Octopussy. And by the looks of it, it was based on the action-packed train scene from the film. On top of said train, Bond could jump between the carriages and would have to fight off gunmen and knife throwers. The game came to electronics expos and people have even played it. With all this going for it, why the hell wasn't it released? Put simply, it wasn't going to be finished in time, most likely missing the time frame of the movie's release. So instead Parker Brothers sought out another studio to make the Bond game we actually got. If you compare the cover art for Octopussy to James Bond 007, you can see it's near identical, just missing the subheading. Believe it or not, but another Bond game around 1983 was scrapped, one based on Moonraker. So it was a pretty rocky start for the 007 game series, all things considered. Now we all know the legendary first-person shooter Goldeneye 007 for the N64, but originally it was pitched as a side-scrolling action platformer for the Super Nintendo. 8 out of its 10 developers at the time had never previously worked on a video game, and seeing as though Rare had had great success with the Donkey Kong Country series, they wanted the game to more resemble that. But ultimately the director and producer Martin Hollis proposed the idea of making it a shooting game for Nintendo's next generation system. Even after all that, it still wasn't planned to be a first-person shooter, but instead an on-rails shooter, with heavy inspiration from the Virtua Cop franchise. This is why the final product includes features such as gun reloading, position-dependent hit-reaction animations, and penalties for killing innocent characters. So in the end, not a cancelled game, but two cancelled concepts for Goldeneye 007. And while I'm still on Goldeneye, at one time a Virtual Boy game by the same name was in development. It wasn't a shooter though, but instead a racing game. Very little footage of this game exists, and the most likely reason it was cancelled was due to the absolute failure of the Virtual Boy itself. The follow-up film to Goldeneye was Tomorrow Never Dies, and if you recall from part 2, a PlayStation 1 game was released based on it, the first 007 game to be published by EA. This was not the original idea, however. On the VHS tape of Tomorrow Never Dies, a minute-long trailer is presented by Desmond Llewellyn, or Q rather, for a game titled Tomorrow Never Dies, The Mission Continues. As the title suggests, it was to take place after the film, being a video game continuation of the story. What's more, the game would have Bond skiing, driving, and scuba diving, not to mention the shooting missions could be played from a first-person perspective. The game was to be released for the PS1 and PC in the fall of 1998, with MGM Interactive publishing it. Now what went wrong? EA stepped in. Having acquired the rights to the Bond license now, they wanted a more traditional movie tie-in and scrapped the idea of the game being a continuation of the film. Obviously that meant dropping The Mission Continues from the title, although they kept the skiing and driving gameplay, albeit in slightly different environments. The scuba mission was discarded, as well as the first-person perspective. And when Tomorrow Never Dies was finally released in 1999, a PC version was nowhere to be seen. Speaking of cancelled PC versions, if you recall from part 3, I mentioned a The World Is Not Enough, or Twine port for the PC and PS2 that was scrapped. Circumstances around this cancellation were a little strange. It was said to be about halfway through development when EA reshuffled and laid off many developers working on the project. Why do this to people working on one of your biggest franchises? Well, here's where it gets juicy. It's alleged that those certain laid-off developers working on Twine stole code and other assets from the team to produce an independent product of their own. EA found out about this and pursued legal action against them. Not wanting any of this to get out, they kept the whole thing hush-hush. And when the dust had settled, too much time had passed since Twine the movie had come out, and talks about the next film, Die Another Day, had already started. So the PS2 and PC port of Twine was canned, the remaining assets reworked into Agent Under Fire, and the rest is history. The poor PC platform getting jibbed once again out of a Bond game. 007 Racing and GoldenEye Rogue Agent were both rumoured to have sequels, though the only information regarding the 007 Racing sequel is that it was a rumour. The initial game did sell well, despite highly lackluster reviews, so a sequel doesn't sound likely to entice players once again, especially those who felt burnt by the first game. You know, fool me once. GoldenEye Rogue Agent's ending very much hints that there's more to come, but again, the game wasn't received very well and its sales weren't great either. It was said, however, that had a sequel come to fruition, the campaign would have been lengthier than its predecessor and even had some driving missions. So there's that. The next game, as well, has very little information out there about it. Going by codenames Bond 6 or Phoenix Rising, in 2003 planning started for a 007 game to be released in 2005. It was said to have gameplay similar to Everything or Nothing, and its story would be a follow-up to Nightfire. The reason it was scrapped? Well, during its planning stage, Pierce Brosnan retired from the role of James Bond. Seeing as though the last two games established his likeness as 007, the developers were caught in a kind of Bond likeness limbo. The game wasn't too far into development, so instead of keeping the likeness of Brosnan or giving him a completely new face, the Nightfire sequel idea was thrown out, and a game based on the 1963 film From Russia with Love was put into production, solving that little dilemma by giving 007 a classic likeness. The next actor to step into the role of James Bond was Daniel Craig, and his video game debut was in Casino Royale, the mobile game. It was a bit of a lackluster debut, but initially a full-blown, big-budget console release was planned. Casino Royale was to be published by EA and come out on the next-generation systems, the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. It was going to be a third-person shooter and would release alongside the film. Much like the planned Octopussy game, Casino Royale wasn't going to be ready in time for the movie's release. It's alleged that MGM weren't too happy about this, as it could have meant a loss of revenue, so the project was shut down with about 15% of it completed. This was around the same time EA was losing interest in the Bond license, as they let Activision take the rights over without contest. Activision would eventually adapt the story of Casino Royale and its sequel into a console video game with the release of Quantum of Solace in 2008. The next game's development is a little weird, but bear with me. James Bond 007 Risico was originally slated for release in 2010 and was being developed by Raven Software, though it was never formally announced. Bloodstone was supposed to be released in 2009, and as I mentioned in part 4, it ends on a massive cliffhanger, so it looks like Risico would have been the follow-up to that story. But then Bloodstone got pushed back to 2010 and was released alongside the Goldeneye remake, so to release another game in that time frame would have been way too much. So Risico was put on ice and Raven Software was moved over to making DLC maps for Call of Duty Black Ops. Bloodstone wasn't received particularly well and didn't sell as many units as Activision had intended. So Risico went from on hold to cancelled. All that's left of it now is this 1 minute long video, footage from one of the animator's show reels. In 2007, development started on a remake of Goldeneye 007 for Xbox Live Arcade. While less a remake and more a remastering, as the core gameplay would have remained intact, the graphics however would receive a fresh coat of high definition paint, which could even be disabled with the flick of a button if you wanted to play with the old school look. It was going to have achievements, time trial leaderboards, and best of all, online multiplayer. All original arenas would make a return, as well as some new additions like Dam and Depot. The game was said to be about 90% finished when Nintendo Japan allegedly refused to grant their permission, pulling out at the last minute and breaking the hearts of GoldenEye fans around the world. While some very low quality footage of the GoldenEye remaster surfaced way back in 2008, in August of 2016, a YouTube channel by the name of Rare Thief uploaded over half an hour of footage of the game in action. There are a few graphical glitches here and there, but as you've been seeing, it looks pretty much complete. To this day, there's never been any kind of re-release of GoldenEye 007 to the dismay of many fans, so you'll either have to bust out the old Nintendo 64 or emulate the game now if you want to play it. In 2010, there was an Xbox Live Arcade remaster of GoldenEye's spiritual successor, Perfect Dark, which was good and all, but I think given the choice, most people would have preferred the GoldenEye remaster. But hey, it's better than nothing. I think that's enough looking into the past. Let's see what's ahead for the James Bond video game series. Unfortunately right now, there doesn't seem to be too many people interested in it, but I did find two companies that have shown a little interest in the license. In January of 2016, Curve Digital's president Dominique Wheatley expressed his and his company's interest in acquiring the rights to Bond. Quoted as saying, "I'd be very happy to have a James Bond license. We could do a cracking game around that." If you don't know who Curve Digital are, they're mostly known for their Stealth series, Stealth Bastard and Stealth Inc. 2, A Game of Clones. These games are both 2D puzzle-solving platformers, and as the title suggests, stealth mechanics revolve around most of the gameplay. This style of game might make a good fit for James Bond, a smaller title, going back to 007's simpler gaming roots. But if Curve has acquired the rights, nothing has been announced thus far. The only other company to express an interest in making a Bond game was Telltale Games, specifically the CEO Kevin Bruner. In January of 2014, the then co-founder and president of Telltale stated he was a huge James Bond fan and how frustrated the games made him, making 007 look like a mass murderer. If you've ever played a Telltale game, you'll know that they are heavily narrative-driven adventure experiences released episodically. Kevin's dream project would be to create this style of game around the James Bond IP, making it more closely resemble the novels and films. Telltale has had enormous success in the past, making these kind of games based around existing properties. The Walking Dead, Game of Thrones, and more recently even the Caped Crusader himself, Batman. 007 could be a perfect fit with this developer, but again there has been no word yet if Telltale has acquired the rights or is even really pursuing them. I mean, right now they have at least 4 games in development. They seem really busy, but you never know. It's really anyone's guess where the Bond license is going to end up, but in the meantime there is a certain group of fans who have so much love for Goldeneye they've developed a faithful remake of the game's multiplayer. Online and for the PC, going by the title Goldeneye Source. It's named this because it's a mod running off Valve Software's Source engine. Development started back in 2005, with various versions being released over the years. The most recent being version 5.0, released on the 12th of August 2016. Most all of GoldenEye multiplayer's signature elements make a return. Selectable characters from the film series, the iconic health bar, no crosshair, slapping to melee, as well as all the unique game modes like You Only Live Twice and License to Kill. All the classic arenas have been recreated near flawlessly, with some new levels added too, some taking inspiration from the GoldenEye movie, others from other Bond films such as Casino Royale. Not to mention it has an excellent soundtrack, comprised of remixes of classic GoldenEye 007 tunes as well as some original compositions. Basically, it's exactly what you'd imagine an online PC version of GoldenEye's multiplayer would be, with the added bonus of it being completely free. Nicholas Bishop founded the project way back in 2005, and even though he sadly committed suicide a year later, the development is still going strong, a whopping 11 years later. I think it's safe to say GoldenEye Source is a labour of love for these developers, and on behalf of all GoldenEye fans, let me just say a big thank you. You've proved that it doesn't take a huge company to make a good 007 game. Well, that's it. That's my look back at all James Bond video games from the past, 1982 to 2016. There's been text-based games, side-scrollers, platformers, races, first-person shooters, third-person shooters, overhead shooters, even RPG and fighting games. Games released for consoles, computers, handhelds, and mobile devices. 007 has to be one of the most diverse gaming franchises ever in terms of genre and platform. There may only be, arguably, one great game, but there's been a myriad of solid titles over the years, and I defy you to find one gamer that doesn't have fond memories of a James Bond game. We can only hope that a good studio will pick up the rights and get the 007 game series back on track. Or at the very least, just find a way to re-release the original GoldenEye 007. Remaster or not, it's such an important title in the history of gaming that it deserves to be easily accessible to future generations or anyone feeling nostalgic for the past. But I'm positive, like the man himself, Bond always returns.